2100 hours. August 21st, 1942. 800 Japanese soldiers crossed the Tenaru River into Marine lines, quietly, confidently. Their commander had told them the Marines were exhausted, demoralized, ready to break. He had told them the crossing would be over before dawn. By sunrise, 785 of those 800 men were dead. 15 made it back. This is the story of what happened on the banks of the Tenaru River, why one Japanese colonel was so certain he would win, and what the Marines waiting in the dark had built that he never knew existed. This is no man's land. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. New documentaries drop every single week. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki was not a man who questioned his own assessments. He had served in China, he had participated in the Nanking campaign, he had spent years in an imperial Japanese army that rewarded aggression and confidence and had punished hesitation consistently enough that every senior officer who had survived to his rank understood that boldness was the institutional currency that mattered. When he was given command of the detachment assigned to retake Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in August of 1942, he received intelligence assessments about the American garrison that told him what the Japanese High Command believed to be true about the force he was going to fight. The Americans had landed on August 7th. They were relatively green troops. They had captured the airfield, but they had done so against light resistance and had not yet been seriously tested in combat. Their supply situation was uncertain following the Japanese naval victory at the Battle of Savo Island, which had forced the American carriers to withdraw and left the Marine garrison with limited resupply. Japanese intelligence assessed the garrison as approximately 2,000 men in uncertain condition, holding a perimeter that stretched further than 2,000 men could realistically defend with adequate depth. Ichiki had 917 men in his first echelon. He had been told to wait for reinforcement before attacking. He chose not to wait. His assessment of the American force was contemptuous in a way that was not unusual for Japanese commanders of his generation and experience. He had seen American units at the opening of the Pacific War. He had read the reports from the Philippines and from other theaters. He did not believe that the Marines holding Henderson Field represented a materially different kind of opponent from what Japanese forces had already defeated across the Pacific. He was wrong about this in every particular that mattered, and the specific nature of his wrongness would define the outcome of everything that happened at the Tenaru River on the night of August 21st. The Marine garrison holding Henderson Field in August of 1942 was not the demoralized, uncertain force that Ichiki's intelligence had described. It was a force that had spent 2 weeks since its landing doing exactly what Marine doctrine required in a defensive situation: improving its positions, understanding the ground, establishing interlocking fields of fire, and building the kind of defensive system that could absorb and defeat a determined infantry assault. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock commanded the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, holding the section of the perimeter at the Tenaru River mouth. Pollock was a meticulous defensive planner, and the position his battalion had prepared along the east bank of the river was not a simple line of foxholes. It was a layered system designed around the specific geography of the river mouth. The mouth of the Tenaru, where it debouched into the ocean, was crossed by a sand spit, a narrow tongue of sand connecting the two banks that was barely wide enough for men to cross in any sort of formation. This sand spit was the only practical crossing point at the river mouth for a force of any size, and Pollock's men had been studying it for 2 weeks. They had pre-registered machine gun positions to cover every foot of the sand spit with overlapping fire. They had placed barbed wire in the water and along the bank to channel any crossing force into the most exposed ground. They had pre-registered mortar concentrations on the crossing point and on the most likely assembly areas on the opposite bank. They had established communication lines between every position in the defensive network and set a watch rotation that kept every position manned and alert throughout the night. What Pollock had built at the Tenaru was not a static line waiting to be hit. It was a prepared killing ground designed around the assumption that an attacker would come across that sand spit, and designed to destroy whatever came across it. Ichiki's force began its approach march toward the Tenaru perimeter in the late afternoon of August 21st, moving through the jungle east of Henderson Field toward the river mouth. The march itself was a demonstration of Japanese infantry professionalism. His men moved quietly, maintained discipline, used the jungle effectively for concealment, and arrived at their assembly position on the east bank of the Tenaru at approximately 2100 hours in good order and without having been detected by the Marine positions on the opposite bank. What Ichiki did not know was that his approach had been reported. A Marine patrol operating east of the perimeter had encountered elements of the Ichiki force earlier in the day and had pulled back to report the contact. By the time Ichiki was assembling his men for the crossing, Pollock knew that a Japanese force was moving toward his position. He had alerted his battalion. Every position along the Tenaru defensive line was manned and waiting. The machine gun crews had their weapons loaded and aimed at the sand spit. The mortar teams had their firing data computed. The men in the foxholes had their rifles and their ammunition and the specific knowledge that something was coming across that sand spit at some point in the night. Ichiki had sacrificed his greatest tactical asset, surprise, before firing a single shot. The element of the Japanese military culture that had produced this sacrifice was the same element that had shaped Ichiki's entire assessment of the battle. He had been told the Americans were not a serious opponent. He believed it completely enough that the kind of systematic reconnaissance that might have revealed the Marine patrol reports and the alert status of Pollock's battalion had not been conducted with the rigor that the operation required. He was crossing a river at night against a fortified defensive position held by a force of unknown alert status, and he did not know whether the Marines were sleeping or waiting. They were waiting. At 2100 hours on August 21st, the first elements of Ichiki's force moved onto the sand spit at the Tenaru River mouth. The Marine accounts of what happened in the next few minutes are consistent across multiple sources. There was a brief period, seconds, not minutes, between the first Japanese soldiers appearing on the sand spit and the Marine defensive fire opening. In that brief period, the Japanese force was committed to the crossing and could not withdraw cleanly. Then the machine guns opened. The fire that hit Ichiki's crossing force on the sand spit was not the uncertain, sporadic fire of a surprised or disorganized defense. It was the concentrated, pre-aimed fire of positions that had been specifically calibrated to cover every point on that sand spit, with overlapping fields of fire. Multiple machine gun positions firing simultaneously into a narrow crossing point produced a density of fire that the Japanese soldiers on the sand spit had no tactical answer for. The sand spit was approximately 150 yards long and in places barely wide enough for men to walk four abreast. A force crossing it was channeled into the most exposed ground in the entire position, unable to disperse, unable to find cover, moving into fire that was coming from positions on the bank above them and from positions on either flank. The Marines on the east bank added to the fire from positions that Ichiki's force had not located and could not effectively suppress. The first assault wave was largely destroyed on the sand spit. Ichiki sent a second wave. The second wave crossed into the same fire. Elements of both waves made it across the sand spit and into the Marine perimeter on the west bank, where they were met by Marines in close combat that lasted until dawn. The fighting in the Marine perimeter in the early hours of August 22nd was the most intense ground combat American forces had experienced since the First World War, and it produced Marine casualties that were real and significant. But the penetrations that Ichiki's men achieved were isolated and tactically contained. They could not be exploited because the force feeding them across the sand spit was being destroyed faster than it could be reinforced. Stop and consider what a pre-registered machine gun position actually means in the context of a night assault across a 150-yard sand spit. A standard American M1917 water-cooled machine gun in 1942 could fire approximately 450 rounds per minute. Pollock's defensive position at the Tenaru mouth had multiple machine gun positions covering the sand spit simultaneously. Each position had been aimed during daylight hours at the specific ground it was required to cover, with adjustments calculated and noted so that the gunner could open fire in complete darkness and hit the pre-designated area without any visual reference to the target. When the Japanese force appeared on the sand spit, the machine gun crews did not need to see their targets. They needed to fire in the direction they had been told to fire at the elevation they had been told to use. And the mathematics of the pre-registered fire would put bullets into the crossing point regardless of visibility. The Japanese soldiers who died on the sand spit at the Tenaru River on the night of August 21st and 22nd did not die because the Marines were better individual fighters or because they had better weapons in any absolute sense. They died because an American lieutenant colonel had spent 2 weeks thinking about how to kill a force crossing that sand spit, had used those 2 weeks to build a defensive system specifically designed for that scenario, and had given his machine gun crews the firing data to execute it in darkness. The force that hit that sand spit encountered not a battle but an execution, a physical system engineered to produce a specific outcome that produced it with mechanical consistency. That distinction matters because it reveals something essential about what Marine defensive doctrine had understood and what Ichiki's planning had not accounted for. The darkness that Ichiki had relied on to conceal his assault was irrelevant to men who had already decided where to aim before the sun went down. As dawn broke on August 22nd, Colonel Ichiki's force had been stopped at the Tenaru perimeter, had suffered catastrophic casualties on the sand spit and in the close combat inside the Marine lines, and had lost the tactical initiative it had briefly held in the first minutes of the assault. What remained of his force had pulled back to the east bank of the river and was taking cover in the jungle and in a coconut grove east of the crossing point. The battle was not over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marine garrison on Guadalcanal, ordered a counterattack rather than simply consolidating the defensive success. A force of Marines from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, crossed the Tenaru upstream of the sand spit using boats to avoid the killing ground at the river mouth, and moved to encircle the Japanese survivors on the east bank, while other Marine units held the perimeter and prevented any breakout to the west. 5 Stuart light tanks were committed to the counterattack, moving through the dense growth of the coconut grove east of the crossing point against infantry that had no effective anti-tank weapons. The Japanese soldiers who had survived the sand spit and pulled back to the coconut grove found themselves in an encirclement. They could not break through, and facing armor, they could not stop. The combination of the encircling Marine infantry closing from the north and the tanks moving systematically through the grove produced a final destruction of what remained of the Ichiki force that took the better part of the morning to complete. The survivors were compressed against the beach by the encirclement, with the ocean behind them and Marines on every other side, with no resupply and no relief force and no option remaining except to die where they stood or be taken prisoner. Most died where they stood. The coconut grove was not a battle by the time it ended. It was the completion of a process that had begun on the sand spit 6 hours earlier. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki burned his regimental colors at the edge of the coconut grove as the Marine encirclement closed around the survivors of his force. The burning of unit colors by a Japanese commander facing defeat was a ritual acknowledgement that the unit had ceased to exist as a fighting force, that what had been entrusted to the commander's care had been destroyed under his command, and that he bore personal responsibility for that destruction in the most direct sense that Japanese military culture could impose. The regimental colors represented the unit's identity and its connection to the emperor's authority. Burning them before capture meant that the enemy could not take them as a trophy. It was the final act of command for a man whose command was ending in the worst way a Japanese officer could imagine it ending, not in a victorious charge, but in an encirclement on a beach, surrounded by the men he had led into a position they could not escape from. Then Ichiki shot himself. He died before the Marine encirclement was complete, before the last of his men had been accounted for. He did not wait for the outcome he had already determined. The 15 men who survived and made it back to Japanese lines were predominantly men who had been at the trailing edge of the assault, who had not yet committed fully to the sand spit crossing when the fire opened, and who had enough distance and enough darkness to pull back before the machine guns found them. They carried back an account of what had happened at the river mouth that described a Marine defensive position fundamentally different from what Ichiki's intelligence had prepared them to encounter. The Americans had not been demoralized. They had not been surprised. They had been waiting in prepared positions with every weapon aimed at the crossing point. That account was specific, accurate, and delivered by the only men who had both seen what happened and survived to report it. What Japanese commanders did with that intelligence in the months that followed is the remainder of the story of Guadalcanal. The final accounting of the Battle of the Tenaru produced numbers that were almost unprecedented in the Pacific War to that point in terms of the disparity between attacker and defender casualties. Of the approximately 800 men Ichiki committed to the assault in his first echelon, 777 were killed. 15 survived and withdrew eastward through the jungle. 8 were taken prisoner, most of them wounded to the point where movement was impossible. The Marine casualties were 34 killed and 75 wounded. Significant losses reflecting the genuine ferocity of the close combat that occurred when Japanese soldiers penetrated the Marine perimeter, but representing a fraction of the losses the attacking force suffered. The kill ratio was roughly 22 Japanese killed for every Marine killed, a disparity that went well beyond what tactical surprise or superior firepower alone could explain, and that reflected the specific design of the defensive position, the failure of Japanese reconnaissance to identify what that position actually was, and the institutional decision that Ichiki had made to attack without the reinforcement he had been told to wait for. The numbers revealed something about American defensive doctrine that the Japanese High Command had not previously had to account for in its Pacific planning. That Marine units were capable of inflicting casualties at ratios that made attrition warfare fundamentally favorable to the Americans, regardless of the size of the Japanese force committed. If every assault on a prepared Marine position produced a 20-to-1 casualty exchange, then Japan's operational arithmetic could not survive sustained contact with Marine defensive lines, regardless of how many reinforcements were committed. The commanders closest to the ground on Guadalcanal drew the most accurate conclusions from this arithmetic. The commanders furthest from the ground drew conclusions that required less revision of existing assumptions, and those conclusions drove the operational decisions that produced the next series of engagements on the island. The Battle of the Tenaru was the first major Japanese ground assault against American positions in the Pacific War, and its outcome established several facts about the nature of the ground war on Guadalcanal that shaped every subsequent engagement on the island. The most important was that the Japanese tactical assumption of the mass infantry assault against a defended position, conducted with speed and aggression and the expectation that American defenders would break under the psychological pressure, did not work against properly prepared Marine positions held by men who were neither surprised nor demoralized. This was not a conclusion that Japanese commanders drew quickly or easily, because the mass assault had worked in other contexts and against other opponents, and the institutional investment in the doctrine was substantial enough that a single defeat, however complete, could be attributed to specific failures of execution rather than to a fundamental flaw in the approach. But the evidence from Tenaru was unambiguous for anyone willing to read it accurately. A well-prepared Marine defensive position, built around pre-registered machine gun fire and properly integrated supporting weapons, could destroy a Japanese infantry assault of any size that was channeled through a fixed approach. The sand spit was an extreme example of a fixed approach, but the principle applied wherever Japanese assault forces were committed to a specific axis against a position that had been prepared to receive them. What the Battle of the Tenaru did not change was the Japanese command's fundamental underestimation of what it was fighting. The months of grinding combat on Guadalcanal that followed were not characterized by a Japanese command that had absorbed the lesson of the sand spit and adjusted its approach accordingly. They were characterized by a command that kept sending forces down the same conceptual road, expecting a different outcome, and finding at the end of each engagement the same arithmetic that had produced 15 survivors from 800 men at the Tenaru River mouth on the night of August 21, 1942. 800 Japanese soldiers crossed the Tenaru River at night. Their colonel had told them the Marines were ready to break. He had told them the crossing would be over before dawn. He was wrong about the Marines, wrong about the position, and wrong about what was waiting on the other side of that sand spit in the dark. 785 men died finding out how wrong he was. 15 made it back. Ichiki burned his colors and shot himself before the encirclement was complete. The men who survived carried an accurate report back to Japanese lines about what Marine defensive positions actually were when properly built and properly manned. It did not change what came next. If this video meant something to you, hit the like button right now. It is the single best way to push this story to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you are not already here. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific or the Marine Corps. We will see you in the next one.